now to the next item on our agenda, which is the report by Mr. Landsbergis, Microfinancial Assistance to Ukraine. We welcome Commissioner Dombrovskis, and I give the floor now to Mr. Landsbergis for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, dear Commissioner, today we will vote on a small part of the EU history. We are voting for 1.8 billion macro-financial aid to Ukraine, which will be the biggest financial package given by the European Union to any third country. But that alone is not so important as to the other, political message. The European Union is united in effort to help Ukraine and to back it when the help is most needed. It has to be noted that our friends, as well as our adversaries, are looking for the cracks in the unity. Ukraine needs our unity in order to sustain clear reasoning for their reforms. Just yesterday we had an opportunity to talk to the Ukrainian Minister of Economy. He gave us a cold but clear overview on the reforms that his ministry and the government are undertaking. Fighting the oligarchic structures, battling corruption and inefficiency in the public sector are just a few points that he raised. It looked to me that even the critics should have been convinced that Ukraine is doing its utmost to reform itself. It is chilling to imagine any of our countries going through that sort of reforms, actually changing dramatically many fields of life that the people were accustomed to. That was one of the reasons why one colleague asked if the minister is sure that the people of Ukraine will keep up and support the pace of the reforms. We were reassured that with a clear message from Europe, that Europe is standing by them, people will support and understand the need for reform. Our foes would rejoice if they see us disunited and use it for their propaganda. We already know what they will say. See, Europe cannot help the country that itself called to sign an association agreement. The Council, Commission, INTA and AFET all called to agree on the proposed report without the amendments because of one main reason. And that reason is that the time is of a crucial importance here. If we vote yes today for the report, the Commission will be able to issue the first tranche of the funds to Ukraine already at the beginning of summer. If we want that the country that is still fighting for its territory would be able to stabilize its budget and economy, we have to agree on providing the funds as soon as possible. And of course I've heard critics say that we are not sure whether the money will be used transparently or are there enough incentives for the reform in the report. Firstly, I believe that at this stage the Commission has foreseen enough control in their document that would be signed with Ukraine after our vote and the following approval by the Council. We are and will remain in close contact with the Ukraine Support Group regarding the reforms and transparency of the funds provided. And when the situation in Ukraine stabilizes, and I want to believe that it will, we will come back to the debate on how we can help Ukraine on its path to reforms. Dear colleagues, I call on you to support this report as presented without amendments and demonstrate our resolution to stand by Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Landsbergis. I now give the floor to Commissioner Dombrovskis.
Madam Chair, honourable members of European Parliament, first of all, I would like to thank the rapporteur, Mr. Gabrielius LANDSBERGIS, and INTA committee for their valuable work on this report and for expediting approval procedures. I would also like to thank AFET committee for its contribution. As you know, the Commission submitted its proposal for a macro-financial assistance operation to Ukraine in the context of enormous political and security challenges in Ukraine and a deteriorating economical situation. Ukraine is confronted with deep recession, its currency has depreciated strongly, inflation has been rising and international reserves have been declining. This shows that the situation is very acute and Ukraine badly needs international financial assistance as soon as possible. And indeed, international donors led by the IMF have wrapped up a new financial aid package for Ukraine with the most recent IMF extended fund facility of 11th of March 2015 amounting to $17.5 billion. The EU is also contributing with its current Commission proposal for a macro-financial assistance of €1.8 billion, in addition to the previous macro-financial assistance operations of €1.6 billion in loans. It is foreseen that this MFA operation will be disbursed in 3 equal tranches, and this is going to be the highest amount of assistance ever to be disbursed to a third country in such a short time. Of course, the new MFA operation will be subject to fulfilment of conditions, namely political preconditions referring to the respect of democratic mechanisms, human rights and the rule of law. Moreover, Ukraine must satisfactorily implement the IMF program, and last but not least, Ukraine must fulfill economic and financial policy conditions to be agreed between the EU and Ukraine in a memorandum of understanding. In this context, potential policy measures in the areas of public finance management, anti-corruption and transparency, the business environment, energy sector reform and financial sector reform are being explored and will be discussed with our Ukrainian partners. I would like to stress that timing is of the essence here. The most urgent and important financing needs of Ukraine are indeed in 2015, and the first 2 of the 3 tranches under the newly proposed MFA operation should be disbursed this year, meaning the first tranche before the summer break in mid-2015. Contrary to its proposal for last year for the MFA operation of €1 billion, which was based under the urgency procedure of the Article 2013 of the Treaty foreseen by the Council decision, the Commission has now based the present proposal on the Article 2012 of the Treaty, foreseeing a decision under the ordinary legislative procedure. The current Commission proposal follows exactly established practice for the MFA operations, a practice also reflected in a joint declaration of the Parliament and the Council of the MFA of the 12th August of 2013. In a view of the urgent financial needs of Ukraine, swift adoption of the current proposal by the co-legislators under the ordinary legislative procedure is very important. Therefore, I am pleased that INTA and AFET committees have approved the Commission proposal without amendments. I am also pleased that the Council, through COREPER, today agreed to adopt the Commission's proposal without amendments. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I now give the floor for the Committee on Foreign Affairs to Mr. Jarosław-WOЛSKI.
Pani Przewodnicząca!
Madam President, Mr. Commissioner, I think that the decision that we are going to take today, and I'm sure it's going to be a positive decision on the MFA and the new tranche of €1.8 billion for Ukraine, will be important not only financially but also politically. Ukraine is really waiting for our support. Its financial stability is at risk. Ukraine is not a poor country, it's badly managed and it needs reform, and it's at war. It has already lost 25% of its economy and a significant part of its territory. A war is costly. It's at war and it's trying to reform at the same time. We have never heard about such a situation in the history of Europe. So it needs monies. It's bleeding out because of the war, and without our financial transfusion, I don't think they will make it. Aid for Ukraine is our political imperative. The biggest gift that we could potentially give to Russia, the aggressor, would be to let Ukraine go bust, and we cannot allow that. Thank you.
Thank you. And now give the floor for 1 minute to Mr. SZEJNFELD.
Dziękuję, Pani Przewodnicząca.
Thank you very much, President. Ukraine is associated with the EU, the consequence of which should be an obligation put on the community to assist Ukraine on its path towards building an efficient administration, or towards restructuring of her. What is important is fighting poverty and building a civil society in Ukraine. Ukraine is now fighting on many fronts, the worst of which is the military one, but the Ukrainians must also carry out very necessary and painful reforms. Without our help, they will not manage. So in the name of solidarity, we should support financial assistance to our eastern neighbor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Mr. BOŠTINARU.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Mr. Commissioner, please allow me to speak in my Romanian language now. Ucraina se află într-o...
Ukraine is at war at present, a war for its survival in front of an aggression from Russia that is carrying out a hybrid undeclared war, but one that is imposed and systematically led after the illegal occupation of Crimea. This should not be forgotten and denied by anyone in this room. Ukraine is a strategic partner for the EU and for the Euro-Atlantic world. Solidarity and European support for Ukraine must be more than ever before substantial, constant and efficient. That is why I'm convinced that this funding amounting to 1.8 billion approved in emergency procedure by INTA, and I'm sure it will be approved today by the EP, responds to this emergency and maintains the coherence of our commitment. Ukraine is faced with severe recession, and the crisis will be prolonged because it is the result of serious macroeconomic and structural problems aggravated by a long-term conflict, and that will probably last for a long time in the future. A message now for the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people. Because these dramatic, painful reforms in a period of war, in order for them to be successful, they need the support of the Ukrainian people. We launch an appeal that the Ukrainian government should never forget that they should lead these reforms together with the Ukrainian people. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1 minute, I now give the floor to Mr. DEMESMAEKER.
Thank you, Madam President. We support this proposal to give the Ukraine macro-financial assistance, and the following elements are extremely important for us. This programme is a reaction to a crisis situation that's been created by structural problems and exacerbated by the Russian aggression. The Ukrainian government has a responsibility to make sure that the long-term structural problems, corruption, selective justice, etc., and deal with them. The conditionality in the MFA programme really has to contribute to bring about these new reforms. And there are some good signals. The Verkhovna Rada is now trying to bring about transparency in the authorities and the apparatus, and they're trying to deal with the corruption, such as the arrest of 2 high-level functionaries who've been arrested on suspicion of corruption. We've seen the scandal with the Transnafta. Means that the oligarchs are going to have to choose between business or politics. And we have to encourage our Ukrainian friends to carry on along that line, because we can help use our financial contribution as a lever to have more democracy, welfare and legal certainty in the population.
The next speaker for 1.5 minutes is Mr. Van Baalen.
Thank you, Madam President. Like all previous speakers, also the ALDE group will support this package, because it's in need, Ukraine is in need of this support. Of course, we must be sure that Ukraine reforms. All the other speakers have also said this. So it would be good and important that inspectors of both the IMF and the EU will be surplus. They will be present to advise, to guide. Because a country of which parts is annexed, parts is occupied by rebels supported by Russia, it's an immense task for the Ukraine to survive. But in order to survive, it should reform. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before I thank you, colleagues, could I just ask for a little order in the House, please? Those who have entered the chamber, the votes will take place around 7 o'clock, because the debates have overrun this afternoon. And I now give the floor in this debate for 1.5 minutes to Mr. Scholz.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. Allow me make it clear that we will vote against the MFA in my group. Let me make another point clear. Our group, like others, would like to see Ukraine remain a sovereign territory with territorial integrity, functioning democratic structures, a country with social security, self-determination and free democracy. the country should be free from the action of oligarchs. We can see the extreme economic difficulties that the country and its citizens are experiencing. We would vote against because we believe that the MFA is linked to the type of macroeconomic conditions that have affected and seriously undermined some EU countries such as Greece. Ukraine will be unable to pay at some point. We will vote against because we believe that the government must apply Minsk II like Moscow. We need to see elected oligarchs in place. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker for 1 minute is Madam Hautala.
Thank you, President. The group of the Greens in the European Parliament is fully supporting this opinion. We feel that it is extremely important to guarantee the sovereignty of the Ukrainian state by avoiding that it becomes bankrupt, because that would be the worst thing that could happen to the sovereignty of the Ukraine. But of course it is true that microfinancial aid is not necessarily ideal for the Ukrainian situation. This is absolutely necessary to give macrofinancial aid, but the Ukraine should be getting more direct grants and support that could help to introduce reforms, institutional building, for example, and in order to finance fight against corruption. But nevertheless, this is a very important proposal in order to avoid Ukraine becoming bankrupt.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Mr. Salvini.
Thank you, Madam President. The Liga Nord is totally contrary to this kind of intervention. It's a wrong choice which just leads to further resentment, and will continue a trade war against Russia, which it makes no sense in 2015. With Russia we should have dialogue, we should have trade, we should have cooperation against international terrorism rather than playing at war. And then it's amusing when talking about sovereignty of a state which isn't even part of the European Union, when for 40 years a member of the EU, Cyprus, has permitted its territory to be militarily occupied by Turkey, with whom some MEPs sitting here talk peace and would like to share the future of the EU. I would prefer these €2 billion to go to European citizens in difficulties, rather than for feeding another war. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker for 1 minute, Mr. Plenković.
Hvala lijepa, gospođo potpredsjednice. Pozdravljam I čestitam našem izvjestitelju.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to congratulate the rapporteur, Mr. Landsbergis, on this report. Mr. Dombrovskis, Commissioner, I'd like to thank you for putting together this package. The MFA, to the tune of €1.8 billion, constitutes a further important contribution from the European Union to the stability of Ukraine. Last week we went to the Ukraine. I, as head of the delegation for Ukraine, was there with my colleagues. We saw the situation on the ground, and especially the financial situation. Various reasons why there are financial problems there affecting this country. Today we're giving out a message of solidarity and unity of the European Union behind helping this country, because a large part of the budget of this country is going to defence purposes for carrying out war. And we think that this amount of money will provide an additional contribution from our side at this particular juncture while Russia is threatening this country.
Thank you, colleague. For 1 minute, Mr. Martin.
Thank you, President. Of course, I agree with those who say that in the time of war, given the capital flight that Ukraine is facing, we have no option but to give them this support and to express our solidarity with the people of Ukraine. However,
I think it's vital that we don't just give the money, that we insist, as the Commission has indicated it will, that human rights reforms are genuine in Ukraine, that the corruption is properly tackled in Ukraine, that democracy is properly embedded in Ukraine, and above all, that the money doesn't end up in the pockets of oligarchs. I've heard people say that the 1.83 billion, $1 billion will go to the people of Ukraine and 0.83 billion will end up in the pockets of the oligarchs. That cannot be allowed to happen. So the Commission must monitor this money very, very closely. We will hear, of course, that it's a difficult situation in Ukraine at the present time. But I think the message we have to send as a Parliament is that the crisis that Ukraine is living through at the present time should be the catalyst for fundamental reform, not the excuse for postponing it. Thank you, President.
Thank you. Our next speaker, Mr. Czarnecki, for 1 minute.
Pani Przewodnicząca, Panie
President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, as the Vice President of the Parliament responsible for Eastern policy, I want to thank the Commissioner for his contribution. I think you, sir, better than many other commissioners understand the situation in that part of Europe better than your countryman, Mr. Piebalgs, who was responsible for the energy policy of the EU, and he would defend Russian operators. So, assistance to Ukraine is necessary. Please stop spreading all this drivel about the war in Ukraine. The fact is that Russia has indeed aggressed Ukraine, and we don't want to push the Ukrainians in the warm embrace of Russia. I think the Ukraine deserves our support. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Madam Kallas.
Thank you. More than a year ago, Ukrainians were protesting in Kiev for closer European integration. A few weeks ago, some were back in the streets, but for different reasons. The price increases for heating, inflation, and the collapse of the currency. It is our responsibility as partners and allies of Ukraine to provide financial support, but it's also our responsibility to help Ukraine with long-term rather than short-term solutions. And these solutions are reforms. Reforms to restore confidence by reinforcing the rule of law, tackling corruption and taking measures to improve the business environment. My country, Estonia, went through these painful reforms for the long-term benefits of a sustainable future. Only Ukraine, as a sovereign country, can deliver these reforms. But as the European Union, we need to ensure that we provide the right assistance that will contribute to changing Ukraine for the better and transforming Ukraine's future. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Mr. de GRAAFF.
President, we should not be sending any money to the Ukraine. You and I know all too well that this government needs 2 billion to carry on the war in the eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian authorities really aren't worthy of this. They don't have the, they certainly don't respect the situation in the east, and Russia is bombing civilians indiscriminately. Thousands of people have died here, and there are no real explanations for the way in which people have died over the past 2 months. And I call on the Commission, don't be an accomplice to the war in this area. Don't go to war against Russia, and don't pay money into the pockets of these corrupt gangs.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Mr. Wałęsa.
Thank you, Madam President. The Ukrainian economy is on the brink of a serious crisis caused by long-term structural problems that have been made more acute recently because of the conflict. So I think financial support for Ukraine at this moment is indispensable, but it has to go hand in hand with reforms. The financial aid from the European Union should be targeted exactly at this, to strengthen the most vulnerable areas of economy. For instance, fiscal stabilization, improvement of economic indices, but also fight with corruption, improvement when it comes to the entire financial sector and business environment. So we should focus on these areas. As a result, the EU will definitely help Ukraine overcome problems and definitely will have its own impact on the realization of the objectives that have been set for Ukraine when it comes to stability and development. I think as a result we will be better able to understand the politics and policy realized by our eastern neighbors. It's very important to make sure that our financial aid should really help the government on the path to the reforms. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Madam Mosca.
Thank you, President. The situation in the Ukraine is still very worrying in economic terms and social terms in spite of recent developments, and the EU can't withdraw from providing aid for the growth of the country, and that's why we think it's necessary for us to grant assistance. Financial assistance, as proposed by the Commission, may make it possible to contribute to the new package of international aid for the Ukraine, directly and indirectly, thanks to the mobilization of the contribution of other partners. We're convinced that the interests of trade policy should be consistent with those of foreign policy, and in this phase it's vital to continue to send out a strong signal vis-à-vis people experiencing difficulties. Providing financial assistance should also send a signal to the government of the Ukraine for them to continue with their structural reforms. We've heard signals about the higher levels of money going to combating corruption and reforming the public administration. We're convinced these are steps in the right path, which should include a higher number of citizens who are acting in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. Monsieur ARTHUIS, for 1 minute, please.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, President. I have just returned from a joint defense and budget mission to Kiev. In Ukraine, war is ongoing, the human cost is high, deaths each day, and hundreds of thousands fleeing conflict zones. Inflation has skyrocketed, the currency has collapsed, the Ukrainian government and the parliamentary majority wish to introduce far-reaching reforms, but they need financial assistance. We welcome the work of European teams working in Ukraine. We met with them. They are not working alone. Countless international organizations are in place in Ukraine. Commissioner, we need coordination between donors, international lenders. We also need coordination across the different services of the European Union, between Brussels and Kiev and within Brussels itself. We need to shorten the decision-making time frame and disbursement timing so that we can tackle the clear emergencies. We don't quibble over the cost of water if the house is on fire. We need coordination and a good balance between good aid and conditions that can be acceptable for the people of Ukraine. The Ukrainian people are looking to Europe with hope. Commissioner, colleagues, Ukraine is a sign of hope for the European Union.
Thank you. I move now to our next speaker for 1 minute, Mr. Rosati.
Yes, Madam Chair, Commissioner, I fully support the draft decision to extend macro-financial assistance to Ukraine, and for a number of reasons. First, we should provide support to a neighbouring country which struggles with massive economic and humanitarian crisis and is a victim of outright military aggression from Russia. This is not only our moral obligation, this is also a very sensible political decision, because we are providing support to a pro-European, pro-reform and democratic government, and in this way we contribute to our own security. Second, the decision to extend MFA is a manifestation of our European solidarity. This is also a symptom of our sense of responsibility for stability in the region. It is a sign of our willingness to play an important role in our neighbourhood. Having said that, I have to call on the Commission to make sure that the money is spent on the support of the reform process and of state building in Ukraine, because we have to make sure that this assistance benefits the whole people of Ukraine.
Thank you. And finally, before Catch the Eye, we have Mr. Picula for 1 minute.
Hvala lijepo. Podržavam stajalište izvjestitelja da se bez...
Thank you, President. I'm in favour of the rapporteur's opinion that we shouldn't table amendments or extend the process for Ukraine because its economy will fall to 6% this year. Last year, the whole economy lost 38% of its value, which was a terrible blow. So hundreds of thousands of people live in conflict zones, and there are 1.7 million children who are suffering from the crisis in the country. Huge amounts of money are vital. 1.8 billion is a drop in the ocean, but nonetheless is an important contribution for Ukraine to be able to protect its population, which has seen its economic and social situation become almost more of a threat than the aggression. Obviously, it's going to be difficult to solve the problem of Ukraine, but this is something that will, in fact, affect the future of Europe, and this is a question of values. Ukraine deserves our help.
Our list now of Catch the Eye. I begin for 1 minute with Mr. Engel, please, and I will be strict on time.
Thank you, Madam President. 1.8 billion we are discussing tonight, whereas we know that Ukraine is very likely to need 50 billion, and there are another 17 or so coming from the International Monetary Fund. Ukraine is facing massive liquidity problems. Ukraine is on the verge of bankruptcy, and I am absolutely certain that the bankruptcy of Ukraine would be worse than a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It would be tantamount to the same. We will need to go further than this, and we know it, and we should not focus ourselves on conditionalities which we know will not be, the Ukraine will not be able to meet. When you're at war, you don't reform the state and save up for winter at the same time. We might have to be much more creative than what we're currently doing. We will have to be much more creative than what we're currently doing. We might even have to conceive of things like opening up the European Stability Mechanism for the Ukraine. Either we will be serious at the end of the day, or Ukraine will go down.
Thank you. Our next speaker on Catch the Eye is Mr. DENANOT.
Thank you, President. By voting for MFA, we should bear uppermost in our mind the Ukrainian people that have suffered and continue to suffer as a result of war, economic and financial crisis. It goes without saying that the European Union should help Ukraine. It is also clear that any assistance should be linked to reform, in particular the fight against corruption in all areas, including that affecting the handing out of university degrees. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Mr. Dzhambazki.
Благодаря ви, госпожо председател. Уважаеми господин комисар, уважаеми колеги. Безспорно икономиката на Украина...
Thank you very much. The Ukrainian economy is suffering. There's an economic crisis there, and indeed a devaluation of the Ukrainian currency, and that's why this package perhaps is so incredibly important. I'd call on the rapporteur and indeed the Commissioner to check all the expenditure very closely. These financial resources should not be going in the pockets of those who are not worthy of the money. I also call on you to make sure that these financial resources be tied to conditions to reform things in Ukraine, especially in the area of the respect of human rights, because I think there is a broad-ranging lack of respect of human rights. there are over 1 million Bulgarians who are in Ukraine.
Mr. PAET.
Thank you. It is of utmost importance that we grant Ukraine the third macro-financial assistance package of 1.8 billion euros. This may not be the end of the Ukraine's needs, and we must be ready for that. Ukraine needs to go on with its reforms, and most crucial ones being fight against corruption, reforming the security forces, taxation system and making business environment better. Trust must be restored in the banking sector, avoidance of tax payments resolved and transparency enhanced. We need to move on with the DCFTA consultations, and this should not lead to the further postponement of EU DCFTA beyond 1st of January 2016. But of course, Ukraine's future depends on when and how the conflict can be resolved in eastern Ukraine. Therefore, the sanctions against Russia must be prolonged until the Minsk agreements are fully implemented. If needed, sanctions must be broadened, and occupation in Crimea has to stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Zuber, 1 minute, please.
The European Union is encouraging Ukraine to introduce reform projects, and that would be excellent if we didn't know what kind of reforms we were talking about, and under conditions that countries that have seen the Troika know about: privatization, labour reform, and the modern paradigm of the EU in line with the IMF, cheap labour without rights. That was the will of the European Union when it came to helping Ukraine, and it actually encouraged nationalist, fascist and neo-Nazi forces, a situation which obviously led to the economic and social situation that's the consequence of war. And once again, protests of the European Union haven't helped the Ukrainian people. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Schaffhauser, 1 minute, please.
Colleagues, I have 3 remarks. First of all, you underscored time and again that the country was at war. According to the IMF international statutes, we cannot intervene in Ukraine because, as you pointed out, the country is at war. Our assembly, our House should comply with rule of law. That is not the case. Second point, our assistance should be tied to conditions. Sanctions must continue to apply to Russia so that they comply with the Minsk agreement. The same should be said for Ukraine. We should only provide aid if Ukraine complies with the Minsk agreement. That is not currently the case. Third point, you interrupted usual, normal electoral process. The country is in a downward spiral. Deaths, problems. Your aid will not do anything to change the situation.
I now give the floor for 1 minute to Mr. Brok. Herr Brok.
Madam President, Vice President, the most recent comment we heard makes it very clear. We have people here on the right who consider that Russian aggression as something worth supporting, and we have people on the extreme left who are celebrating that violence. For that reason, we must recognize that we're talking here about a situation that a country in Europe has to enjoy freedom. The economic assistance that we want to decide on today, and thank you to the Commission for this proposal, that needs to be built on and expanded so that this people has a chance to enjoy normal macroeconomic assistance. It's a freedom fight of a country, both against the right and left. It's not a question of supporting a dictatorship, it's about supporting the freedom of the whole of Europe.
Thank you. Our next speaker on the list is Madam Smolková.
Thank you very much. Ukraine has long been in a very poor economic situation, and the war conflict has deteriorated the problem. Therefore, providing macrofinancial assistance to Ukraine is something I'm supporting, provided this assistance is being monitored to make sure that the funds are used to reduce the poverty of the population. At the same time, the Ukrainian leaders should facilitate their struggle against corruption, fraud, and in order to tighten tax collection. When in 2010 we approved microfinancial assistance to Ukraine, one of the conditions was to implement essential structural reform or other measures to prevent and counter corruption. Now we're in 2015 and we're again urging Ukraine to do the same. Therefore, it is relevant to ask the question, are we in a position to make sure that the financial assistance ends up in the pockets of the population and not in the pockets of the oligarchs? Commissioner, please give me an answer.
I now give the floor to Commissioner Dombrovskis. I would ask colleagues, before I give the floor to the Commissioner, just to have a little bit of silence in the room. Votes will be within a few minutes. Commissioner.
Madam Chair, honourable members of European Parliament, first of all, I would like to thank European Parliament for a quite broad support for Commission's proposal, which we could see in those debates, and indeed it's quite important that we are moving forward with this financial assistance to Ukraine, given the both security and economical situation developments in Ukraine. Some of the colleagues raised the question whether this financial assistance is sufficient, and quite clearly that we will need to discuss further steps, further support, further involvement with Ukraine in coming months and years. It's certainly a step which is now moving forward. Also, some of the colleagues raised the question of the purpose of this macrofinancial assistance. It's also outlined very clear that this assistance can be used only for non-military purposes. But I would like to underline once again the urgency of this decision in the view of immediate financing needs of Ukraine and the need to make the first disbursement to Ukraine before the summer break. As you know, amendments to the Commission proposal could trigger a second reading and significantly delay the adoption process. Therefore, based on the valuable work of the rapporteur and INTA committee, I count on your support for this important financial assistance programme to Ukraine in these difficult times, and urge you to vote today in favour of the Commission's proposal without the 12 amendments tabled last week. President of the European Commission, Mr. Juncker, is also going to Kiev next week and hopes to be able to deliver the good news in person. Thank you for your attention, and I hope for your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I now give the floor to our rapporteur, Mr. Landsbergis.
Dear colleagues, I have to say that I'm very optimistic. I hear the unanimous voice of so many groups in the Parliament of support for Ukraine. And I hope that in a few moments we'll all be proud members of the European Parliament who made the right decision. So thank you again for all the support and your wisdom.
Thank you, Mr. Landsbergis, for your brevity and clarity. Colleagues, that ends our debate. Votes will now follow, so there will be a short intermission. Thank you.
Guten Abend.
Well, good evening.
Yeah. So, guten Abend, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Because we're a bit delayed, we will not be taking the explanation of votes, the oral explanation of votes, immediately after the vote. We'll take them at the end of today's debates. First of all, we'll be voting on the Kurtzos report on the mobilisation of the European Globalisation Adjustment Fund. As a roll call vote, and we need a qualified majority of the votes cast. Vote is open. Has everybody voted? The vote is closed. That's carried. That brings us on to the Christoforu report, mobilisation of the European Globalisation Adjustment Fund. Once again, roll call vote. Once again, qualified majority. The vote is open. Has everybody voted? The vote is closed. That's carried. Moving on to Mr. Chrysogonos' report on a request for the waiver of immunity of Antonio Marinho e Pinto. Those in favour, please show. Those against? Abstentions? That is carried. Now Mr. Zwiefka's report on a request for the waiver of immunity of Mr. Ivan Jakovčić. Those in favour? Those against? Abstentions? Carried. On to the Negrescu report on the mobilisation of the European Globalisation